Hey, fifth grade. For today's writing workshop lesson, we're going to be talking about narrative leads. You guys know we started a new genre of writing and a new unit. We're working on narrative writing, but specifically we're creating memoirs. And essentially that means that we're bringing a memory of ours to life for our readers to experience alongside of us. And at the same time, as a writer, hopefully revealing why this memory is significant and why our brain and our heart has hung on to it for this amount of time. So hopefully we're revealing our so what, and we're figuring out why we felt compelled to write about this particular memory in the first place. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you guys about leads. I talked to you about planning sheets the other day because I wanted that to be fresh in your minds. And then I also want you to be thinking about your leads before you actually start, because there's a method to creating a lead that begins inside the experience. We learned in our unit on free verse poetry that good leads always start inside the experience. They don't need a few stanzas, or in this case, a few paragraphs or pages of background information. That stuff can be woven in as you unfold the story or as you unfold the memory for your reader. And so I wanted to show you a couple of different techniques to do that. And then I also wanted to point out what a typical lead looks like. And I want to reiterate that typical does not necessarily mean good when it comes to writing. We don't want to be too predictable or too ordinary, because our readers get bored when we do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in and get started. If I had to name the most important part of a piece of prose writing, I'd have a hard time deciding between the lead and the conclusion. The lead is critical because it sets the tone, it determines the content and direction of the piece, and it establishes the voice and verb tense, as well as intrigues or doesn't the potential reader. Most important, the lead grounds the writer. A good lead fuels writing. It makes the rest of the piece easier to write. The bad news is that a good lead can be hard to write. Often, beginning storytellers have trouble starting their stories in the story. Instead, they produce a paragraph or 2 or 10 of background information before they feel justified in launching into the good parts. I think they see the beginning at the beginning as being faithful to their experience. But story readers don't want a catalog of details. They don't need a timeline. They want an inviting story. I think there are 3 basic ways to start one. The notes, by the way, on narrative leads can be found on page 25 of your ELA reference folder, or if we're in distance learning, you're quarantined, or you're just not at school today for whatever reason, I've also attached it to this assignment so that you have access to it. I've also included little clips of these notes in this actual video and presentation, so just hang in there, and if you need to refer to it after you've watched the video and after the lesson is over, just know that it's there for you. Scott, a 7th grader, had a great story to tell about how a bunch of teenagers drove a car into Rangeley Lake near his family's camp, and how he and his dad hauled it out the next day. Under the heading Typical on your reference page or your notes about narrative leads, you'll find Scott's first lead. Read along with me. It was a day at the end of June. My mom, dad, brother, and I were at our camp on Rangeley Lake. We arrived the night before at 10, so it was dark when we got there and unpacked. We went straight to bed. The next morning, when I was eating breakfast, my dad started yelling for me from down at the dock at the top of his lungs. He said there was a car in the lake. Now, this is a typical lead. It's not a good lead. It's just what students are tempted to do when they're charged with the task of creating a story or a memoir. They like to go into almost news reporter mode and give us a who, what, when, where, why, and how kind of paragraph to lead readers in. However, it's not always effective, and this one certainly isn't. Scott has almost written a newspaper lead here. He gives us the who, what, when, where, and why information, but not a voice, not a direction for the rest of the memoir, and not a sense of him, Scott, so we can see, feel, and participate in his memory. So together, Scott and his teacher, Nancy, tried 3 new ways into his story. First, they wrote a lead that jumped into the action of the story with the main character, Scott, doing something. So we would call this an action lead, and that's what you'll see on your reference page or in your notes. You'll see that after the typical lead, we have the action lead. And this is where your main character starts out by doing something. Follow along with me as I read. I gulped my milk, pushed away from the table, and bolted out of the kitchen, slamming the broken screen door behind me. I ran down to our dock as fast as my legs could carry me. My feet pounded on the old wood, hurrying me toward my dad's voice. Scott, he bellowed again. Coming, Dad, I gasped. I couldn't see him yet, just the sails of the boats that had already put out into the lake for the day. So you can see that this lead is much more inviting for the reader. You're already wanting to read on because you want to know what his dad is yelling about. And it sets the tone. I mean, he has told us that it's morning without actually telling us it's morning because he's gulping his milk. He's sitting at the breakfast table. We can make those inferences because we're educated readers. We can figure that out. And it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the piece too. And something big is happening because he's rushing down there and his dad is yelling from the lake. So this lead is much, much better. And he did that with him, Scott, doing something. He was eating breakfast and then he ran down to the lake in response to his dad yelling. The next type of lead that we're going to talk about is what we call a dialogue lead. So after Scott and his teacher Nancy created the action lead, then they went in and created one that starts with dialogue, with the people in the scene speaking, which is a different kind of action. So follow along with me as I read the dialogue lead. Scott, get down here on the double, Dad bellowed. His voice sounded far away. Dad, I hollered, where are you? I squinted through the screen door, but couldn't see him. I'm down at the dock. Move it. You're not going to believe this, he replied. Now, this is very similar to the first lead where it started out with Scott actually doing something. We heard Dad yelling in that lead, but we didn't get to hear his exact words or the exchange. And so in this one, they've created a dialogue lead. We get to hear a little bit more of the conversation that Scott and his dad would have had yelling back and forth. And again, this lead starts inside the experience. It tells us some things that we need to know without coming right out and telling us in news reporter style. Plus, it makes us curious. We're like, what is so important that he's yelling for him to move it and that he's not going to believe what he sees? And so as a reader, we want to keep reading. And as a writer, this kind of sets the tone and sets up what's going to happen next. So it provides direction for Scott, the writer, and it creates motivation to keep reading for us, the reader. Next, they went inside Scott's head and wrote his reactions. This is the third type of lead that I'm going to share with you. They started with the main character in mid-thought. So one of the things that I love about books as opposed to movies, you know, we've all seen them, the books that get made into movies, and we all know people who've just gone and watched the movie. The thing that I love about the books, more than the movies most of the time, is that when we're reading a book, we get to see inside a character's head and heart, if it's been written in an omniscient or a first-person point of view. We get to have their personal reaction all to ourselves. And it doesn't have to be spoken out loud or it doesn't have to be acted out as it does in a movie in order to let us know what's going on with that character. So it's one of the reasons that I love that a book or prose rather than being able to see it on the movie. Regardless, a character's personal thoughts are always valuable because it allows the writer to connect with what they're feeling and what they're going through. We don't have to wonder what they're thinking because we get it in the text. So I think you'll see what I mean here. Follow along as I read this reaction lead. I couldn't imagine why my father was hollering for me at 7 in the morning. I thought fast about what I might have done to get him so riled. Had he found out about the way I talked to my mother the night before when we got to camp and she asked me to help unpack the car? Did he discover the fishing reel I broke last week? Before I could consider a third possibility, Dad's voice shattered my thoughts. Scott, move it! You're not going to believe this. I hope what you're able to see in this lead is that we get a real sense of who Scott is in this lead because it allows us to peek at his personal thoughts and feelings and the kind of person that he is. You'll notice that all three of those leads were very similar. Most of them included the same things, with his dad being down at the lake or the dock and shouting to come down there. But it was just three different ways into that same experience or piece of action, I guess, if you will. I think that each of these leads does what a lead should do, and having three alternatives helped Scott choose a starting point he liked and felt inspired to pursue, versus the sinking feeling a writer gets when he tries to stick out a dull lead to the bitter end. Do me a favor, open the novel you're reading these days, skim the lead, and notice what the author did to launch the story. Did they move right into the action, begin with the characters talking, describe a scene, or start the novel with the main character's thoughts about something? I have a novel here that is part of our Battle of the Books, and I'm going to read just a little bit of the lead to you and see if you see what I mean. That good writers use these types of leads. All right, here we go. This is from Mr. Tuckett, by the way, by Gary Paulson. Chapter 1. Francis Alphonse Tuckett came back to life slowly. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't want to open his eyes until he remembered everything that had happened. Yesterday had been Francis's 14th birthday, and he celebrated it quietly. Usually his mother and father and even his 9-year-old sister Rebecca made a big thing of birthdays. They had friends in, and a giant cake cooked to perfection on his mother's huge wood-burning stove. And by 4 in the afternoon, everybody was so full of homemade ice cream and cake that they couldn't move. But that was how it had been on the farm in Missouri, where they had the big house and the barn. Yesterday, they had celebrated Francis's birthday on the tailgate of a Conestoga wagon at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was June 13th, 1847, a warm summer Tuesday in the new country, and they were in a wagon with a wagon train on its way to Oregon. Francis, on awakening that morning, thought that even without any sort of birthday party, it would be his best birthday yet. How many boys of 14 had ever seen drawings of the Rockies, let alone the real thing? That was an adventure in itself, not to mention crossing the great Kansas plains and watching the train scout Mr. Ballard hunt buffalo for the wagon train. But then there had been a party, or at least a sort of party. As the wagons had squared away for the day's journey westward, Francis's mother called him from helping his father hitch up some oxen to the yoke and tongue of the wagon. He went to the rear where there she was, sitting on the tailgate was a cake. He had no idea how she had done it. Her stove was way back in Missouri, too heavy for the wagon, and he had not seen her doing anything special on the buffalo chip fire that morning. But there it was, a cake, and easily one of the nicest cakes he'd ever seen. All right, guys, I kind of went a little further in than the traditional lead, but you can see that this particular lead starts with a reaction, a personal reaction. So this is Francis's internal thoughts and feelings about something that's happening. And I hope what you noticed is that the author, Gary Paulsen, weaved in the details that a reader needs to know and understand what's going on. And one of those things that a reader needs is the setting. And so we got some information about where the story is taking place, the historical period, and kind of where they're at and what the characters are doing. But because it's a personal reaction, we also kind of get an idea of the kind of person that Francis is. And you see that in his appreciation for the fact that his mother figured out a way to make a cake, but also the scenery and the beautiful Rockies and the backdrop of where they're at. So again, Gary Paulsen used one of those techniques that we were just talking about. I think if you look in your novel, you'll see the same thing. Maybe you won't see a reaction lead, maybe you'll see dialogue, or perhaps you'll see an action lead where the main character is doing something, and then as things cool down there, then the author weaves in those details that you needed to know. All right, guys. So what practical use can you make of this information? I think you can write good leads deliberately. That means on purpose. First, when beginning a memoir or a short story, craft several leads just the way Scott did here. Experiment with different ways in. A lead you love will fuel you as a writer. Choose the way in that makes you happiest. It will make your readers happy too. On the next slide, we're going to check out Colleen's alternative leads for a memoir about Country Town, an imaginary village she and her friends created in the school's woods when they were first graders. She played around with leads, first reaction, then dialogue, and then action, until she felt her beginning, until she found the way in that she was itching to pursue. All right, so you see her first lead here, and then you see her second and her third. I'm going to read those to you. I must admit, I didn't think it would ever work. We couldn't possibly create a town out of sticks in the woods behind the barn. But when Erin flashed me her reassuring smile, I knew anything could happen. So this is a reaction lead right here. And now we're going to look at what I think looks like a dialogue lead. Do you guys see the quotation marks? Ellie, Erin, Meg, come on, I shouted. They finished tying their shoes and then yelled back, coming, Colleen. We linked arms and ran out the door and into the warm sunlight. It had begun. Okay, and then her third lead, which I'm going to take a guess is going to be an action lead because we've already seen a reaction and a dialogue lead. Here we go. We galloped down towards the woods that grew behind the barn. With no clear intentions, we begin to move sticks, and soon the sticks take on a life of their own. So again, here they are doing something. Here's a conversation, and then in this one, we get a personal reaction. Do you notice that her leads are not really long? They're just a few sentences. So when you're playing around with picking the right lead or creating multiple leads, don't let the fact that you have to create 3 leads weigh you down. Just know that it's worth the investment of time and it's going to give you options, and it doesn't have to be terribly long. Hers is just a few sentences. So keep that in mind, guys, as we begin to write our own. And then last, let me end with a hint. You'd be amazed how often kids have already written their good lead, but it's buried in the draft. If you're working on a memoir right now, or let's say you start writing a memoir without writing 3 possible leads, and it just doesn't seem to be working or it doesn't pull readers in, then take a look at your draft and see if you have one of those who, what, when, where, and why leads, and then see if you can cut that opening paragraph or even the first page. Look for a point where the action of the story begins. That's your lead. You can embed or weave in the background information as the rest of the story unfolds. Also, just a quick reminder, guys, after this lesson, please don't forget, after watching the video, to go in and complete and submit the What Did You Learn form that's found in the Your Work section of this assignment. It's just kind of a little exit ticket to let me know what you took away from today's lesson, and kind of helps me prepare what our next steps can be. And it also offers us both a little bit of accountability. So, all right, guys, I know that was kind of a long one. I love and miss you. I can't wait to see your faces and to be with you in person. If you have any questions or need anything at all, don't hesitate to email me or message me or let me know. I'm happy to help you, and I can't wait to see you soon.